Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening if you're in the UK. Good afternoon if you're joining us from the United States. My name's Dr. Sam Edwards, and I'm one of the trustees at Soulgrave Manor, and it's my great pleasure to host this evening's Soulgrave seminar. We're live and we're online, and we've got two fantastic speakers for you. Before we get into the talks, though, just a little bit of information about what we're doing. This is the second of our online seminars for this academic year, 24-25. Our theme for this year has been that of alliances, and our first seminar in February of this year saw the brilliant Catherine Carter talk about her wonderful book, Churchill's Citadel. So we talked about the origins of the alliance there with Winston Churchill. This is our second seminar of the series, and we're sticking with that theme of alliances. But this time, I've got two experts for you talking about some of the legacies of the Second World War, especially with regards to transatlantic history. And I'll introduce them in turn. Each speaker is going to talk for 15-20 minutes or so. And at the very end, we've got some opportunity for some conversation and also for some questions. And if you want to ask any questions, you're very welcome to do so. And you need to use the question and answer function on Zoom here. So we're going to start with Kate Lemay in just a moment's time. So Dr. Kate Lemay is a historian at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at the Army War College. She's the author of the 2018 book Triumph of the Dead, which is a study of American military cemeteries overseas and their function as diplomatic spaces, and she's going to be talking a little bit about that this afternoon. And before joining the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, she was a historian at the Smithsonian Institution. So without further ado,
Hi, everyone. I think Sam might have been frozen, but I'm going to go ahead and share
hand
my screen.
over to your thoughts.
So welcome, and thanks again for tuning in. My research is centered on the American war cemeteries that are located in Europe, particularly in France. You may or may not know that nearly 90,000 American soldiers killed during World War II are actually buried in Europe. And these are 14 war cemeteries that were constructed between 1948 and 1956. What I would like to do today is to discuss how these sites of memory play a large part in cultural diplomacy or soft diplomacy. And I argue that they do it through design. As you may have guessed, I'm a trained art historian, and I've long been fascinated by how art and architecture causes people to reflect in new and different ways. The questions I ask as a trained art historian are: who funded these works? In what historical contexts were they built? And how were they received? So keep those three questions in your mind as we move throughout this PowerPoint. We're looking at the Normandy American Cemetery. Recent years at the Normandy American Cemetery, it has hosted more than 1 million visitors per year. And what's interesting to me is that the majority of those visitors are French. This sheer number demonstrates how the cemetery stages day in and day out cultural diplomacy in the form of Franco-American tribute, as well as war memory. So in planning the war cemeteries during this immediate moment after World War II, there were US artists and architects such as John Harbison, you've probably never heard of him, or Leon Kroll, you've probably never heard of him. And they, even if you've never heard of them, they were pretty smart guys, very good at what they did, and they were anticipating a French audience. So they were not alone in this anticipation. The German architect Robert Tischler and his team of colleagues from Munich were also anticipating a French audience for their war cemetery designs. So I'm going to explain how these day-to-day political relations that were happening at these cemeteries were planned out by this set of men, of these strategists, if you will. And it was really particularly thought out through the 40s context of the Cold War. And I argue that the iconography and the design were meant to support conciliatory relations for the Germans and global leadership for the United States. And I'm also going to consider how and analyze how that patterns of French visitation to both the German and the US war cemeteries demonstrate how effective they were in their goals. So, for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with the history of the US war cemeteries in Europe, here you can see the big difference, and that is the United States repatriated um, families at the request of the next of kin. The United States repatriated the remains of soldiers, and this was the difference between Commonwealth war cemeteries, German war cemeteries, and American war cemeteries in particular. So, concerning its war dead, the US is the only country to have offered this choice to families. And here you see coffins that are decorated with US American flags on a ship debarking from Cherbourg for New York City in 1947. And it's interesting to me that repatriation was one of the reasons why the cemeteries were redesigned from their original grid-like layouts and made into these sites of major works of art and architecture from the US mid-century artists kind of group. So here you can see, we're back at look at Normandy American Cemetery. I wanted to say that each cemetery has a memorial chapel, a battle map, and commemorative funerary sculpture. And so this is very specific for American designs. The different other countries have different templates for their designs. But in the US war cemeteries, the headstone, I argue, is the most important design component because it achieves this iconic status. The same headstone design is used in every cemetery from World War I and World War II. So Paul Cret was a French-born architect who moved to the United States in 1906, and he brought the Beaux-Arts tradition, if you will, to the University of Pennsylvania. And he is the one that really designed these iconic symbols. The engineering below these headstones, they keep them ramrod straight. And they have these very specific proportions. And they are only used in overseas American cemeteries. So hence the iconic kind of symbol that they achieve. You don't see them, for example, in the Arlington Cemetery, the famous military cemetery in Washington, D.C. And these headstones are very strictly ordered in these seemingly endless rows, and they punctuate this kind of vast and sweeping space of the entire cemetery with this pristine white austerity. They're made of Carrara marble. And walking among them, if you've ever done this, you can remember probably that it creates a movement in your vision and kind of a heightening of your spatial awareness just because of the alignment of the different headstones. They align, they separate, they realign, and they seem to move with you as you are moving. So there's this visual effect that achieves almost like an inert army of stone that you are visiting. And that is intentional. That is one of my arguments, that the American architects and artists were thinking intentionally about reminding European audiences of the sheer number of Americans that were involved in these conflicts. So this Latin cross design was chosen in March of 1924. And again, you can think about how material is so symbolic, the white marble being the victor, of course, in death. And it's very important to just keep this in mind because by comparison to other nations, the US American participation was pretty slight, especially in World War I. So there is this dramatic kind of reminder, if you will, of the participation of US soldiers because of that minority presence that they had. So they wanted to have single graves for every fallen soldier. And so this visceral imprint that the headstones achieve is very much a purposeful design. The material displays this rich wealth and obviously reflects this sort of symbolism of sacrifice of the most noble dimensions. And it's really not by accident. I would argue again that these headstones look like soldiers standing alert, at attention. And with their Judeo-Christian iconography, these markers really do create a small army of martyrs in each cemetery. So this overall aesthetic, overall goal in World War I as well as World War II for the United States designers was to present these fallen soldiers as martyrs to a European audience and therefore representing the United States like a Christ-like martyr. So if these soldiers, if you follow this train of thought, if these soldiers were martyrs, then they were of a national collective. And this is interesting because identifying information on the headstones reveals an emphasis on nationalism and even nativism with a selection of only two religious symbols. The inscription includes the name of the fallen, their rank, military service, state of residence upon joining the military, and date of death. And to be honest, that's not very much information. It's nothing personal. You have no idea how old this soldier is. And it's very much kind of the national collective, but not about that soldier personally. By contrast, even though it is also for the collective, the Commonwealth headstone achieves this much greater degree of personalization by inscribing the age upon death, and even more importantly, inscribed at the base of the stone is a 60-letter epitaph that was chosen by the next of kin. So, for example, on the right, you can see Clarence Wright, who was a private with the South Staffordshire Regiment. He died on July 8th, 1944, so you know the invasion of Normandy. But he was 27, so that helps you understand a little bit more about that loss of life. And then his family chose the following to be inscribed, and I'm quoting this epitaph: "We could not say goodbye, but we would give the world to say hello to you today, mother, dad, and all." The American headstones, again, by comparison, they lack this individualization. So I was taken by this. I'm sure you've also made these comparisons if you're familiar with these cemeteries. But what's interesting is that the German war graves really go national and lack an individualization. They list the name, the military rank, and finally the birth and death dates. And you can calculate the age upon death, right, if you're good at math. But including, so they're trying to include some individualizing of the soldier buried, but it's pretty subtle. The American cemeteries had a grave registration service, and these are the initial grave diggers, part of the U.S. Army. And they laid out the German war cemeteries in La Combe and Marigny, Orgland. These are all cemeteries in Normandy. So you can see this kind of at the bottom of this grid map, the enemy sector that was for the Germans. And they really are kind of interesting to note this process that the Americans were burying individual German graves as well as the American compatriots. They followed a protocol to bury the dead in these individual graves. So they made archives of, their records, and they also made these early graves for the German soldiers. And I think it's interesting because it wasn't until 1952 that the German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund Deutsches Kriegsgrabe für Soldier, were able to obtain authorization to begin constructing their own memorials. And they then, with Robert Tischler, started to introduce their designs beginning in 1961. So obviously the Germans were using this dark stone. That's a tradition from World War I as well. But what I think is really interesting is that they sought to hide numbers and downplay the might of Germany during World War II. So for example here in this picture, you can see the pairs of fallen soldiers or more are listed under one headstone. And so the pairing of the fallen is really obvious when you compare it to the individual grave that was made by the Americans and in the very beginning. And so I'm thinking that there's two possible explanations for this burial approach. Let me go back. So this is the plans for the La Combe Cemetery from 1944, which again had both US and German soldiers' graves. And so I'm thinking for practical reasons, the German architects really had to make the best use of the space possible. So they were burying two people under one grave at least, right? But it also seems like a drastic change of plans from this original layout. I mean, that is a lot of unearthing and moving around and reburying, right? And they were not like the US where they repatriated remains. So they were doing this of their own will. And one scholar estimates that in Normandy, American soldier takes up 28 times more space as the German soldier. So, okay, what are we looking at here? On the right, you see a grid. Those black dots with the blue square, I put a blue square around one just to highlight it. It's the original burial of by Americans of the German soldier in Le Camp. So these are the American-made burials for the Germans. And then the boxes with numbers are the layout of the German bodies that they created for their own permanent burial in the same space. So they're adding more and more bodies to this smaller space. And on the left, just for fun, I put an image of the Quartermaster General, which is the American Graves Registration Service, their burial handbook. And it has this graphic element, describing sort of their method of burial in the trench method. So back to my argument, though, I would suggest that the German architects were using aesthetics to create a new impression of war and therefore a new memory for the French audience. So here in Le Camp, we're looking at the stage when it was being redesigned by Robert Tischler in 1959. And the German headstones are in the shape of the Maltese cross, and they're discreetly set flat into the ground instead of upright like those at Orglan that we're just looking at. And so there's 5 sets of small crosses that you see amidst the sort of landscaping. And those are Maltese crosses, and they're just decorative. They're not grave markers. But the headstone, which you see on the left, is set into the ground. It's much less visible, and consequently, it really mutes the number of dead. So the visual impression is really this overall landscape of sorrow. So what? Well, I'm arguing that design is making a big difference on collective memory. Because if you design a landscape with fewer headstones, it visually erases the number of German soldiers that fought for the tyrannical forces of the Nazi regime. A strong post-war Germany was a dangerous notion in 1960s France, and so any display of numbers of German soldiers, even dead, it was not politically acceptable. And so if we see here by comparing Le Camp on the sort of the bottom with the Normandy's American cemetery, you see that there's no endless rows of German soldiers. So if you think about what the original architect was thinking, Robert Tischler, his objective was to simplify. And it's not just him. Here, the Munich-based architect Johannes Hearn, he designed this room-like compartments, and they oriented them in a circular fashion around this significantly sized field that contained a mass grave. And this is Mont du Puy. This is kind of near the Mont Saint-Michel. And the remains were placed in these small boxes of 80 by 30 centimeters. And then they were installed behind these plaques in the compartments. And you can imagine that the bodies must have been just barely there anymore. But the mass grave, it's interesting, was used coincidentally in Le Camp, as you see here in the bottom right image. And it reflects the original Totenbergen, or Fortress of the Dead, design of the Nazis. Instead of a swastika crowning the mass conical grave, a man and a woman, presumably parents, or a Jesus and a Mary figure, they're shrouded by a Latin cross. So, okay, just to start summarizing, we have the US cemetery as a site of triumph, and the German cemetery as a site of sorrow. And how then did the French visit these places in the immediate post-war? I argue that the Norman French especially have wrestled with their war experiences. It's enmeshed, their memory is enmeshed in these war cemeteries, not just those of the United States, but also those of the Germans. Because as you can see, beginning on June 6, 1944, in this bittersweet twist of fate, Normans welcomed the very allies whose bombardment just prior had killed as many as 20,000 civilians in Upper and Lower Normandy. And so for most Normans then, June 6 was really the traumatic beginning of a devastating war, as the war happened across their landscape, in their buildings and their lives, and their city kind of day to day was ruined. So if you look at the principal cemetery of Saint-Lô, this is a plot for 250 graves for the nearly 500 victims of the June 6th bombardment. And you can see how the sparse words describe in this very transparent but very subtle way, the horror that they experienced, the miserable death that these people must have endured. And some are just listed as bones, ossements, that's bones. Others have locations because the remains couldn't be identified. For those who are identified, there's no date of birth. It's just very simple. And the whole collective feeling is that they are part of this long plot, victime du bombardement 6 juin 1944. So you have the French identification of them as victims of the bombardment. And extreme right groups, they've capitalized on this difficult history throughout the eras, and iterations of their resentment have occasionally in France and Normandy, but continuously surfaced at the American war cemeteries. And you're looking at anti-Semitist, anti-American slogans that were spray painted on the side facade of the Normandy American Cemetery. And other more public expressions are, by Michel. They're kind of subverting public gratitude to position the region of Normandy as a region of martyrs. And so loosely translated, this sort of visitor's book says, you, brave German soldiers, you killed less French than our allies, the Ricains. Ricain is like a slang term for Americans. And then he goes on to number the number of deaths that they're claiming happened in Caen. And then he wrote, I witnessed the landings at Hermanville. So this is an entry I saw over and over again in German war cemeteries across Normandy. So I hope that my presentation today has given you some new things to consider in regards to how we remember World War II, and in particular, how art and architecture design really influence our memory and therefore our transatlantic relations. I'm happy to speak about more about my argument, but in short, I think that in France, I think that the German war cemeteries really accomplished a lot of interesting transatlantic alliance work, if you will. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. There will be chance for questions a little bit later after we've heard from our second speaker today, Dr. Hattie Hearn. Dr. Hattie Hearn is a curator at the American Air Museum. She holds a PhD from the University of East Anglia, and she's an author of a book and another book that's on its way. So she's got a book out already from 2023, Tales of World War II, which is a fantastic children's book, and she's also now working on another book at the scholarly end of the market, and that should be coming out hopefully next year with the History Press, titled Welcome to Little America. So now we go from American military cemeteries in Normandy to an American museum in Cambridgeshire. Dr. Hearn, it's all yours.
Thanks. I'm just going to share my slides. As Sam pointed out there, I am the curator of the American Air Museum, and we are located in Cambridgeshire. And the museum is part of the Imperial War Museum, their Duxford site, and it's dedicated to telling the story of American air power in Britain. And the real focus is on the Second World War and the American presence in Britain during the period of 1942 through to 1945. And today I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the American Air Museum to tell the story, a very brief history of the US bombing campaign from Britain during the years 1942 to 1945. So a little bit of context about the museum and how it came to be. So the museum opened in 1997, and it came about really from a huge fundraising campaign, which really was a collaboration between Americans, particularly American Second World War veterans, and enthusiastic British supporters. And the museum sits in this fantastic building designed by Lord Norman Foster, and it was opened by the Queen back in 1997. And today it is home to the largest and the best collection of American military aircraft on public display outside North America. So our collection of aircraft ranges from the First World War through to the present day. You can see from that photo we've got the humongous B-52. We also have the F-15 Eagle, a Warthog, we've got a B-29, and of course we've got the iconic B-17 and B-24. And what really sets the American Air Museum apart to many other aviation museums is that when the AAM was redesigned in 2016, there was a much greater emphasis placed on telling the stories of conflict, rather than just the technological capability of the aircraft on display. So the purpose of this really is to connect the visitor not just with the tech and the hardware, but also the personal stories of the people, the men and women who flew these aircraft and who also serviced them, and who are also the civilians who lived within the remit that these aircraft served, and also the civilians who lived under the bombs that many of them dropped. So the first stop on this tour is going to be the Flying Fortress, possibly the most iconic aircraft in our collection and one of the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War. And the B-17, along with the B-24, would be the backbone of the US bombing strategy in Europe. So developed and produced by Boeing, the B-17 first flew in 1935 and entered service with the US Army Air Corps in 1938. And what makes the B-17 a symbol of the air war in Europe is the fact that it is the aircraft that the US bombing doctrine was based upon. So a group of strategic planners known as the Bomber Mafia had been enamored with the B-17 since its maiden flight in 1935. And it was during this public debut that the B-17 earned its nickname, the Flying Fortress, thanks to its many 50 caliber guns, which helped to provide a complete arc of fire to protect the bomber. And the Bomber Mafia's doctrine was really based upon the idea that the B-17 could deliver high altitude, daylight, precision bombing against industrial and military targets deep within enemy territory. And the success of this doctrine really pinned on that B-17 being able to put the bombs on the targets, which they believed it could do with the help of the Norden bomb sight, a new bit of tech that it was equipped with. And then also the ability to make it back to base, no matter what punishment was being thrown at it. And the US Army Air Corps finally got the chance to put these principles to the test in 1942 with the creation of the 8th Air Force, following the United States entry into the war. And by the summer of that year, B-17s were embarking on missions over occupied territory. The B-17s that went into combat were manned by 10 airmen, so you had 4 officers and 6 enlisted men, and the crew consisted of a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator and bombardier in the nose of the aircraft, a flight engineer who also manned the top turret gun, a radio operator, and then 2 waist gunners in the waist of the aircraft, a ball turret gunner in the ball at the bottom of the aircraft, and right back in the tail you had another gunner. And through the objects in our collection, we tried to tell the stories of aircrew from all of these different positions. And really what comes through is the endurance that these men had to go through for a mission that could last up to 10 hours. So flying at 25,000 feet, the crews could endure temperatures as low as minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And throughout that mission, they'd have to be connected to not only heated flying suits, but also to oxygen to prevent them from passing out. And they also would have to endure whatever the enemy was going to throw at them. And the skin of the B-17 was really, really thin, so probably no thicker than a Coke can, and that really offered no protection against enemy flak or fighter fire. And for the crews who were embarking on those first few months of missions, survival rates were appalling. And we're going to get into that in a second. But the events in the air really is only half of the story. To support these bombing operations, hundreds of airfields had to be built or taken over. And so in total, the USAF knew that it needed to house approximately 17,000 aircraft in Britain to launch this attack on occupied Europe. And they needed the airfields to operate from. So there were already some RAF stations which the RAF could use, and Duxford, where the American Air Museum is housed, was one of those permanent air bases that were handed over to the United States in 1943. However, many more air bases had to be built if the Americans were to launch the number of aircraft that it needed to. And in order to fulfill this requirement, engineer aviation units were brought in from the States to begin construction works. And many of these aviation units were in fact segregated Black American units. So the US Army at this time was segregated, and these Jim Crow rules were brought over to Britain with the US Army. And one of those units was the 923rd Aviation Engineer Regiment. And one of the stories we tell in the museum is that of James Waddell, who was a member of this engineering battalion. And he was dead set on actually fighting during the Second World War, and he planned to volunteer for the Canadian Air Force to fly as a gunner. But by the time America entered the war, his only real choice to get into the fight was to join an engineer battalion, which he did. And he and his comrades were set to work building airfields in East Anglia. And one of those airfields that he helped to construct was Debbage, located in Suffolk. And in the museum, we have a lump of concrete from Debbage. And just to kind of give you a sense of the amount of concrete that was needed. So this one piece contains approximately 1/4 of a cubic meter of concrete, and it would take over 133,000 cubic meters to build a typical bomber airfield. So another 500,000 pieces of concrete like this one. And the impact of this construction can still be seen on the landscape today. So you'll see here that each of these pointers denotes a different air base operated by the US Army Air Forces. You can see this, they're highly concentrated in the east of England. The blue dots are the bomber bases, I hope I get this right, the yellow dots are the fighter bases, the purple ones are depots and also special operation airfields, and the kind of reddish dots are 9th Air Force bases. And you can see these are just taken from Google Earth, and they show 4 examples of bomber bases, and you can still see today the imprint that they've left on the landscape 80 years on. So each of these bases would have housed approximately 3,000 men, and they would have been a hubbub of activity 24/7. So you can imagine for the local communities who lived around these air bases, the sudden arrival, the sudden influx of thousands of Americans really completely changed the social fabric of their lives and their communities. However, for the Americans fighting the air war, in those early months, they were completely occupied with just staying alive. So in early 1943, the average life expectancy of an 8th Air Force bomber crew was just 11 missions. And the loss rate on any daylight mission was 5%. So anyone with a basic knowledge of probability could calculate that a crew would be lucky to make it past their 11th mission. Morale, as a result, was dangerously low as casualties continued to rise, and flyers really needed an incentive, a reason to keep on getting back into their bombers. So on the 9th of March 1943, the Central Medical Establishment recommended the introduction of a fixed combat tour. Bomber crews would fly 25 missions to qualify for a return to the US, which would then increase to 30 missions in March 1944 and 35 missions in August of the same year. And attention was also turning to how the US would keep the public on side despite the mounting losses. The USAF enlisted journalists and filmmakers to publicise their work. And William Wyler's famous film, The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, would be possibly the most famous outcome of this publicity campaign. And the story follows the outcome of one particular B-17 aircraft, the Memphis Belle. And while the Memphis Belle wasn't the first B-17 to complete 25 missions, it was the first to complete its missions and return to the US. And the film's message was clear. The air war was hard and dangerous, but crews did survive the terrible odds, and the job was getting done. And it made heroes of its subjects. So the crew of the Memphis Belle, after it completed its tour, would go back to the US and complete a war bonds tour. And William Wyler himself would gain fame for his documentary. And if you watch it, I really recommend you do. It's freely available actually on YouTube. It's in the public domain. It really gives a taste of what life was like on a B-17 in the early months of the air war. And William Wyler himself would actually go on to become the most successful Hollywood director, holding the record for the most Academy Award nominations for Best Director with 12 nominations. And in the American Air Museum, we're very proud to have William Wyler's uniform on display, as well as his cigarette case, which he carried with him everywhere, and which he got a lot of famous people in the European theatre to sign. So on it, you've got the signatures of all of the members of the Memphis Belle crew, as well as Winston Churchill, Eisenhower, and Ira Aker. So it's a real treasure that we're very lucky to have on display at the museum. Another area of the air war which we highlight in the museum is that of the interaction between Americans and local children. And it's become a really important part of the cultural history of the US air war. And ask any child who was a child at that time, they will tell you that the really enduring memory is this phrase, "Got any gum chum?" which was a phrase that was bandied around during this time. So young children would go up to Americans and they'd say, "Got any gum chum?" And often they would get a stick of gum in return. And this really is illustrative of the mutual relationship between American GIs, many of whom really weren't that much older than the children they were interacting with, and the children for whom the presence of the Americans would completely change their childhood and really become a pivotal memory, a touchstone memory in their childhood. For many children, their days would be spent going down to their local airfield and watching the aircraft depart and then counting back the aircraft as they returned. And what came with this was a certain element of heartbreak. And we have this really quite evocative object in the collection, and that's a copper-bound Bible. And this particular Bible was found on an airfield close to a crash site of two B-17s that had collided at Polbrook. And it was found by a young lad who kept hold of it for decades and decades before eventually handing it over to a veteran from Polbrook during a reunion. And it eventually ended up in our collection. And other children kept souvenirs of their interactions with the Americans. So one of our most recent acquisitions is this scrapbook, which contains many chewing gum wrappers. So when you flick through it, you see all these colourful wrappers from across the States, also from Canadian soldiers. And for the young lad who collected these scrapbooks, these wrappers, and pasted them into his scrapbook, they really were his pride and joy. And they would often be great currency to exchange with other children at school. And again, they really act as a visual representation of that kinship between children and Americans. And this friendship would also extend to women. There were many romantic relationships, and in fact, more than 60,000 British women would end up marrying Americans during the war and returning with them to the States. And the children, in particular, once grown up, would really be the driving force behind memorialisation efforts in Britain. So, for an example, the control tower at Thorpe Abbotts, home of the 100th Bomb Group, would be restored in the late 1970s and the early 80s as a memorial to the 100th Bomb Group. And those children, now all grown up and now well into their late 70s and 80s, still maintain that control tower as a memorial. And it's really interesting that relationship has also affected the historiography of the period. So the backbone of the American Air Museum's photography collection was compiled by Roger Freeman, who's a name I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. He really is the seminal historian when it comes to the history of the 8th Air Force. And in the museum, we show these notes which Roger kept when he was a schoolboy, growing up close to the 8th Air Force airfield of Boxted, which was a fighter base. And he kept really careful notes of all the comings and goings on from the local airfield and many of the other airfields of the 8th Air Force. And these would be very useful when he was later writing up his histories of the mighty 8th, which was in fact a term that he coined and which has now become synonymous with the 8th Air Force. So going back to the history of the 8th Air Force, towards late 1943, the 8th Air Force operations were almost becoming unsustainable. Such were the losses that they were enduring. But that all really changed with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. And you can see here the Mustang that we have on display in the AAM. And the Mustang was really important because it had the capability of escorting B-17s and B-24s all the way into Germany and all the way back. And suddenly the Americans had a weapon that could help tackle the problem of German fighters, which were completely ravaging bomber formations up until that point. And Duxford has a really important link to the development of the Mustang in one particular character whose story we tell in the museum, and that is Len Thorne, who was a pilot with the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford in 1942. And Len and his team recommended that fitting a Mustang with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, like the sort of engines that were being fitted into Spitfires at the time, would drastically improve the aircraft's performance. And as I mentioned, that pivotal change would create a fighter which had the capability of finally fighting the Luftwaffe threat. And the Mustang would become one of the most successful aircraft of the Second World War. Over 8,000 were built, and within that history, you've got stories of incredible aces. One of those we tell a story of is another story that's located close to home, and that is of Huey Lamb, who was a P-51 ace with the 78 Fighter Group based at Duxford. And I particularly love Huey's story, not only because he's actually still very much alive and still living in Texas where he grew up, but also because he would often come back to Duxford and visit his old base. And I love these photographs we have of Huey with his pet dog, who he adopted as a stray puppy at Duxford. He named him Brussels because when he found him, he was as small as a Brussels sprout. And yeah, Huey's such a great character, and it's a complete honor to be able to paint our P-51 in the colors of and markings of Huey's P-51, which he nicknamed Etta Jean after his baby sister. And another war-winning aircraft would be the B-24. A lot of attention goes to the B-17 when we're talking about the European Air War, for good reason. She is probably the more attractive of the two aircraft, and she was also the aircraft that garnered all the fame through the likes of the Memphis Belle film. However, the B-24 would play its own pivotal role in the air war, and that is because more B-24 Liberators were built than any other American aircraft during the Second World War. And they could also carry more bombs further and faster than the more famous B-17 bomber, at least in the early part of the air war. And the huge mass production of the B-24 was really thanks to its unique design, which enabled it to be mass produced on a real huge scale. And at the museum, we have a crane, which is actually from the Ford Willow Run in Detroit. And Ford Willow had been a Ford production plant producing cars before the war, but during the war it was converted to produce B-24s, and the production line was actually a mile long, and at its peak production it could produce a B-24 every hour, which is phenomenal. And in the museum, we tell the story of some of those workers who were constructing B-24s. One of my favourite stories is of Henry Beddow, who was actually a circus performer before the war, and he was employed by Willow Run because he had a unique characteristic. He was actually short enough and small enough to go into the wing of the B-24, and from there he could do the rivets. So the likes of Henry, and also Judy Hubbard, who we also talk about. She was one of the riveters who had become so adept at riveting that she could actually produce, I think, if I get the statistic right, she could complete 8 aircraft skins in one single day, instead of the standard 5, which was the standard that workers were expected to complete. So the likes of these civilians, their work on the home front helped to produce B-24s and other aircraft in the numbers required to keep up with demand. And it was a pivotal factor that eventually helped the Americans to put formations of up to 2,000 aircraft in the air at any one time, to take part in 8th Air Force bombing missions towards the end of the war. And it's just the sheer scale of that operation, that capability, that helped to turn the tide of the air war in the kind of early part of 1944. So I just want to end by talking about the Counting the Cost Memorial, which is located at the entrance to the American Air Museum. And this is a really striking memorial that a lot of people miss. And on each of these glass panels are small aircraft engraved. And overall, there are about 70,000 of these aircraft engraved on these panels. And each one of these aircraft represents a different aircraft that were lost flying from Britain during the Second World War. And this is just one of many memorials. Like I mentioned, the American Air Museum is itself a memorial. We also have this Counting the Cost Memorial, and in the museum itself we have our Roll of Honour, which contains the names of approximately 25,000 American personnel who died while flying from Britain. And if you travel throughout East Anglia, you'll find memorials throughout the landscape. Sometimes they take the forms of just simple plaques in churches. They sometimes take the form of stone memorials. We also, of course, have memorial museums located in control towers. We have memorial libraries, even stained glass windows in churches. And all of these are part of a landscape that is full of history and it's full of memories. And they are sustained today by the children who lived with the Americans and who really felt their loss once they departed. And it's a privilege that I have as a curator of the American Air Museum to try to preserve and to tell those stories through interpretation that really engages visitors and tells those personal stories of loss and sacrifice. So if any of you are in the area, please do come and visit us. Please let me know if you've got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hattie. And this is that point in proceedings where we can take some questions. We've got some time here. If you want to ask Hattie or Kate a question, then please just open up your question and answer function on Zoom and throw the question in there. And if I see it, I'll ask it. Whilst I'm waiting for you to hit away at the keyboard, I'll start by just offering a few thoughts myself and a question for each of our speakers. I was struck there by two fascinating talks, distinct in their content, but some wonderful crossovers as well, especially on that subject that Hattie picked up at the end landscapes of memory is ultimately what you were both talking about here. So I thought I might go straight in for a relative biggie, and first to Kate and then to Hattie. And I'd just be interested, Kate, your thoughts on what do you think about the current state of World War II memory within Normandy right now? That relationship between the landscapes that you've described and the audience that French audience and the people and the communities of Normandy. And then I'll ask my question to Hattie in a moment's time. But Kate, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's complicated, and there's some people who are descendants of those victims of the civilian bombardment who remember and started actually speaking about the family's losses in 1995, 1994. So there is quite a bit of time that had passed. And now I think the next generation is far removed from that loss. And there's a little bit more of embracing of the tourism that is, really marks Normandy as it's an iconic place to visit for Americans. It really is because of D-Day, the greatest amphibious invasion of history, right? So people want to see Omaha Beach, Utah Beach. They want to see where the Commonwealth also participated and the Canadians. I mean, there's a lot of military buffs, but then there's also those who are just interested in iconic American history. I think the French are incredibly generous and really, really hospitable. And they treat, as you know, as both of you know, they treat World War II GIs who are still with us like rock stars, as they should be treated. I don't know. Sometimes I kind of think about the tourism making a really somber and important place for war sacrifice and a change agent for the world. I feel like sometimes it's treated like a tourist, sort of like a circus,
Mm-hmm.
and I get a little conflicted about that. But who am I to begrudge the selling of beer and some nice trinkets if that's going to improve the French person's livelihood, right? So I don't know. It's kind of a mixed bag.
Mm. That's really interesting, Kate. Thank you. And I'll pick up on your phrase there, Kate, and Hattie, interested in your thoughts. Do you think that the landscapes that you've talked about there, do they hold the same kind of iconic status? Do they have that similar sort of draw as Normandy, or is it a little bit different?
Yeah, what's really interesting, last year with the release of Masters of the Air, there was a lot of discussion about whether the landscapes of the 8th Air Force would become as iconic as the landscapes of Normandy as a result of Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan. I know that really had an impact on tourism to the region. And I think a lot of the local tourism boards were trying to capitalize on East Anglia's kind of moment of fame with Masters of the Air. I think that, I know from kind of personal experience as a volunteer at Thorpe Abbott that attendance and visitor numbers have hugely increased, and many of those people walking through the doors have been watching Masters of the Air. But I don't think that it has had the same kind of effect on creating this really iconic landscape as you see in Normandy. But what I think is really interesting at the moment, and particularly this year, there's been so many memorials that have been being unveiled to commemorate certain bomb groups, certain support units. For example, there's a memorial going up to commemorate the hospital which served and treated many 8th Air Force victims, but also to just small memorial plaques to individual pilots who went down. So we're still seeing very much this memorial landscape develop, and I think perhaps we're at a juncture now where a lot of the people who were children during the war are now trying to pass that on to the next generation. I know we still get a huge number of veterans' families come to the region to kind of walk in the footsteps of their fathers and grandfathers. And for many of those people, they still describe it as a sort of a homecoming. There's still that kind of personal connection to that landscape, even though they're not the ones with that lived experience. So I still think that it's a very changing landscape, and it's a very interesting time to be looking at this sort of thing and seeing how this kind of memory is being handed over to a new generation.
Thank you so much, Hattie. We've got a bunch of questions that have popped in here. I was going to ask some things, but I'll shut up and I'll pass on the questions that are coming in. One for you first, Kate. It's Norman. Norman asks if you could say something about how the separate concerns and interests of individual memories as opposed to collective memory and how that works out. And I wondered if you were to talk about that, maybe you could tell us about that decision not to include any space on the American headstone for words from family and how that was received by next of
Yeah.
kin. So
Well,
so the individual versus the collective.
it's a great question, and it really does reflect how the audience interest has changed. I would say in the 1990s and early 2000s, biography started playing much more of a role. And in Hattie's curatorial work, I can see, this is all across the pond, in Europe and America. We're really interested in telling stories about the personal experience, beginning with William Hitchcock's The Bitter Road to Freedom, if you're interested in that work that he wrote that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. There's a lot of biography was kind of poo-pooed, as a historical lens because it's so subjective. But because people wanted to understand the humanity behind this sacrifice, they went that way. And I don't know why the 20th century really focused, the majority of it really focused on this collective memory. I think it was probably because we were less connected. We didn't relate as well. It wasn't until the internet that we started getting really into biography. So that's kind of interesting to consider. And in terms of the letters that have been written on the Commonwealth, which is my, wow, the Commonwealth does such an amazing job safeguarding these personal, collective versus collective memory. I think it's because the American Battle Monuments Commission, they considered allowing 60 letters to be chosen by the next of kin during World War I for like 3 months. And the American next of kin got really snotty. And they chose things like killed in action. So they didn't personalize it. They pointed out that their son or daughter was killed in action rather than through disease. So they were setting up this kind of hierarchy of death, and that was not what the ABMC wanted, the American Battle Monuments Commission. And the other thing that they would do was that they would select kind of highbrow scripture to quote, because in the American society at that time, if you were Episcopalian or if you were of a certain kind of religion, it signaled your status socially. So there's this kind of icky undercurrent that was going on where American families were just trying to show off, and they also had to pay for the writing. They had to pay for it themselves. So only wealthy families were able to do this. And it's unfortunate, they missed the chance, I think, to be personal.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, and Ewan's got a couple of great questions in here for Hattie. Ewan, we're not going to be able to get to them, but I will make sure Hattie gets your questions. And instead, I think to round things off, I'll go to a question from Orla, because it's a good one, I think, for both of you. And we've only got so much, relatively brief answers, if that's all right. But just wondered if you could say something about your thoughts on how the processes of memorialization are changing, might change as the veteran generation sadly passes on. Hattie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, gosh, it's difficult. It's difficult to kind of predict, I think. I think it's easier now to look back and see in the 70s and 80s we had that period where again, like Kate mentioned, that we were looking more at the collective memory, and we're looking at the stories of particular bomb groups rather than personal stories. But yeah, I'm probably noticing more a trend towards looking at the stories of individuals, and my hope is that will include some of the stories we don't have. So the women who served at these bases or with the American Red Cross, or the black the Black Americans who served on the airfields, maintaining the airfields, constructing them. So I think that we are going to have a move towards more looking at kind of micro histories rather than grand narratives. I think all of the national memorials are there and all of the bomb group memorials are there, but it's going to be more a case of individual veteran families and kind of enthusiasts picking up individual stories and focusing on them, which I think would be really interesting to see.
Is that your thoughts as well, Kate? That we're into an era of more kind of the complicating of the big narratives?
You know, I'm a skeptic, and I think that the money is where it's going to fall. And whichever association or whichever wealthy family has the means to organize a memorial, they're going to make it happen. And as someone who had studied memorials, and I'm now at a place that, people are very eager to put memorials in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, I'm constantly kind of fighting that off because I don't want a memorial that's being paid for by some rich association. I would rather have a memorial that my staff of historians and curators have judged to be important in history. And so this is where I think we are in a delicate moment. And if you look at the Lost Cause in the 1930s and the way that memorials popped up everywhere in the United States, we might be getting back into that moment. I think we already have in a little bit. If you think about what plaques are out there and they're attached to steles and they're really, really ugly. And I can say this again because I'm this snooty art historian, so forgive me, but I would much rather have a memorial that makes you pause and think and is not just a list of a bunch of names that doesn't have any commemorative design to it. So I'm really skeptical about memorials, most likely because I've just studied them too much.
Thank you so much, Kay, and thank you so much, Hattie, as well. We are just about out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap proceedings up now. If we didn't get to your question, my apologies. As I say, you and I'll pass on your questions to Hattie, and Kate, Ewan's got a good question for you as well. So you and I shall make sure that those get passed on. And before we wrap things up, though, just a couple of things for me to say. First is, I hope you very much enjoyed this evening's seminar. It's been our second in our theme for this year, which is alliances, and we've had an eye, as you can see, on the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and been thinking about the legacies of that conflict within transatlantic history. Next year's seminar series, we're underway with the planning, and no surprises given the fact that this is Soulgrave Manor, ancestral home of George Washington, and the original home of the Special Relationship, that next year our series is going to turn its attention to America 250, to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Details on that to follow in due course. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one next year.